My people, I hope their life has been well. You know, in this North Georgia region that I've been blessed to call home, there is quite the diversity of railroad operations to entertain a foamer such as myself. But in the midst of all the different rail lines, there is one that I particularly enjoy seeing railroad traffic on. The CSX Gainesville Midland Branch. Very windy and hilly, and therefore very dead, piece of CSX trackage that connects CSX with Norfolk Southern, and which also serves a bunch of local customers. And since we're in North Georgia, some of these local customers are inevitably agricultural, which is why the only other traffic that runs this line, besides 2 locals throughout the week, are as-needed grain trains. Grain trains like the one that I happened to come across abruptly, but not unexpectedly. Now, the full lore of this train will actually take us back to Indiana. The loads that spawned in earlier originally came from CSX G315, which runs from Evansville, Indiana, down to Athens, Georgia, where these loads will take the CSX Abbeville subdivision to be dropped off at one of the many feed mills owned by Pilgrim's Pride in the North Georgia area. At least that's the fate for some of these cars.
What do you mean by that?
If we go back just south to where this feed mill is, we'll find Fowler Junction Yard, which has a few tracks for storing cars and which allows G315's power to run around their train and back it into the feed mill just north of here. And as you could imagine, with a name like Fowler Junction Yard, there must be a Fowler Junction, which happens to lie at the north end of the yard. And coming to this side of the yard reveals 4 tracks that split off in 2 different ways. The 2 left tracks continue on the CSX Abbeville subdivision and head towards the Pilgrim's Pride feed mill in Athens, and the right 2 tracks connect to the CSX Gainesville Midland Branch, which will be the next leg of the journey for all the cars from G315 that don't get sent to the Athens feed mill. These cars will instead run up on CSX G908, which runs from Athens, Georgia to Gainesville, Georgia, taking the CSX Gainesville Midland Branch as the head to yet another feed mill that's owned by Pilgrim's Pride. Now, as I mentioned before, this train is as needed, so there's literally no predicting or scheduling when this train will come in, but if you know the right people and have the right connections, you can find yourself seeing a train traversing some very steep grades and sharp curves as it heads up to Gainesville, Georgia. And on this afternoon, my boy Silver, Common Media, and I, along with a couple other guys, all had come out to see this move. Now, while Silver had been following this train since it departed Athens, I was performing some elite cutting up trying to intercept this thing somewhere south of Gainesville along this branch. Unfortunately for me, G908, originally having 2 motors on it when it left Athens, actually ended up stopping at Pendergrass Yard in Pendergrass, Georgia.
Why?
Literally because the AC was broke on that lead unit. So they made a quick pit stop here to pick up another motor, which I'm sure delayed their time.
We do not care.
But thankfully for me, it allowed me to see this train on even more of the Midland before they would hit their terminus at Gainesville. And so after making an abrupt pit stop, once I saw this thing while I was driving around looking for it, I'll meet up with Silver and we would start collectively following this train on the last leg of his journey. First starting off just outside of downtown Talma, Georgia, where we get a view of some of the grades that these loaded grain trains have to take as they make their climb up to Gainesville, Georgia. From this spot, we would hit the road trying to get as much head-end shot to this train as we could, and eventually finding ourselves here at this very long curve, arriving here quickly just before G908. If I haven't said it enough, the geography on this line is absolutely ridiculous, which explains why trains on this line are both infrequent and not very long. And especially for a loaded grain train like this, they tend to not go very fast, which proved to be pretty fortunate for me and the crew, as we would quickly leave this spot and move to the top of a rather steep hill where we could see the quarry that belongs to Heidelberg Materials and see just how steep of a climb this train has to take in order to hit Gainesville. Once again, with this train going slow, we would easily beat it and push towards the S-curve that lies next to a few industries that the locals on this line serve, and is also part of the descent that this grain train will take from this big hill before it hits yet another big one. For those of you who saw my first Midland video, you may recall the first spot we caught that local at. That one very steep hill that you could tell is very difficult for trains to climb. Yeah. Well, there was no other way for G908 to hit the Pilgrim's Pride feed mill in Gainesville without having to tackle this grade. And thus we would find ourselves here, seeing this train howling as it conquers the last few miles of its journey before the Gainesville Pilgrim's Pride feed mill. Fortunately for the crew, this was the last really big hill that they would have to conquer before they would find themselves right outside of Gainesville, Georgia. And with the feed mill being only a few miles away, we hopscotched to the last spot that we would be able to see this train before it would begin its work of putting away its cars for the day. G908 is crawling at this point because they've basically arrived at the mill. From Google Maps, we can see that from this crossing that we're standing at right now, the mill is maybe a mile or two away. And if you're attentive, you may notice an issue here.
What are you talking about?
Because all the tracks that lie next to this mill are a dead end. So G908 here has no way to turn around here to be able to back in its cars into the mill trackage and into the storage tracks that lie around it. However, just south of the Pilgrim's Pride feed mill here is yet another tiny exclusive yard, which doesn't really give much to look at, but this yard is very important. Without it, the CSX grain operation here is impossible. So the way that this will work is that G908 is going to pull forth to the north end of the yard. Once the entire train clears the switch at the north end, the conductor will hop off and fill the switch so that they can reverse some of their train into one of the storage tracks that's in this yard. Once that track is full, they will pull out the train to the north end of the yard again, and then reverse the rest of the train into another one of the tracks. And then the power, having put away all of its train, will pull forth to the north end of the yard again, and utilize the one remaining track that's still left in this yard to run around their whole train and come back to this crossing so that they can be on the right side of their cuts of grain cars to reverse them into the mill and the storage tracks. So as you can imagine, with most of this process involving the north end of the yard that we can't see, there wasn't really too much to see besides G908 slowly moving by us on its way to fully clearing the north end of the yard. However, about 15 minutes later, we could see the two cuts already being stored into the yard, and then another 20 minutes later, we would finally see the power return to the crossing. At this point, their train has been completely put away, and now they are free to use the one remaining track that lies in this little yard to run around all of their cuts and clear the switch at this crossing to then reverse into their cuts and back them into the feed mill. With the power having coupled up, the next stage of the activity would be at the feed mill. So knowing where this train was going, and also getting some intel that there were a few Norfolk Southern trains set to come through this area soon, we would leave this crossing and make our way toward the Amtrak station that lies on the Norfolk Southern side, where we can see evidence of Norfolk Southern's own grain activity that lies in this area. As I mentioned before, we're in North Georgia, there are a lot of farms, so agricultural customers are all over the area, and these customers do not lie exclusively on CSX. While CSX may serve Pilgrim's Pride, which we can actually see from the Norfolk Southern tracks here, Norfolk Southern services Cargill, yet another agricultural operation, but this one being more on the side that actually deals with us. In contrast to CSX, Norfolk Southern trains run the Greenville district through this area in order to drop off trains filled with soybeans to be delivered to the crush plant here, where these beans will be cracked in order to break the hull and begin to be processed. Once Norfolk Southern delivers the train, they will help stage some of the cars, but the actual switching of the cars inside the mill is done by specific cargo locomotives that lie in Gainesville, Georgia, which, if you happen to come at the right time, right after a grain train has come in, you can see as they move in and out of the limits of their trackage, switching the cars that Norfolk Southern has brought in and unloading them at the plant here, which explains these 4 locomotives that we're looking at right now. The 3 Norfolk Southern engines came in on Norfolk Southern 44R, the train that delivers the soybeans, while that one green locomotive off in the distance is one of the usual 2 units that's assigned to this plant for switching the cars that come in from Norfolk Southern. Never mind all that though. Even though we knew some NS trains were going to be coming in soon, our present focus was on the CSX side, where shortly after coming here, we would see the tail end of G908's cuts beginning to get pushed into the feed mill here. And that wasn't the only thing we were seeing. These gates, for whatever reason, were defunct to a grand degree. They kept activating on and off for whatever reason, and because I have connections, I knew that there was no train nearby, so these things were just straight malfunctioning.
Zero purpose.
And they weren't just malfunctioning. Oh no, these things were hungry. Villainous and carnivorous intent for any vehicles that happened to be too close. Besides that, back to the CSX side, after initially seeing those cars stopped outside of the feed mill trackers, we began seeing G908 perform its work around the feed mill and begin sorting its cuts on the tracks that lie in and around the facility. Throughout this entire process, the gates were glitching out of their mind, but now there was actually Norfolk Southern activity in the area. Those 3 units that originally came from 44R actually came online and began reversing towards the cargo facility, which could only mean one thing, that its southbound counterpart, Norfolk Southern 45R, was going to collect the emptied soybean hoppers and then take them out back to where they came from in the Midwest. While Norfolk Southern is removing empties, CSX is bringing in loads, each to their respective facilities. So as G908 was continuing to do its work, we could see 45R's trio of GEs slowly approach the switch that lies just outside the cargo plant, and we could see the conductor on the ground manually flipping the switch to allow the power access to the plant and the storage tracks with all the empties. Meanwhile, G908 was continuing to sort the last cars of its first cut to be brought into the feed mill. While the power sneaks off deeper into the Pilgrim's Pride facility, our attention would finally return to something that's actually running on the Norfolk Southern main line. At last, these gates would have something legit to activate for, as Norfolk Southern 153 approaches the station here, approaching us on its way to Chandler, Georgia to get some work done, and also having a little surprise in the Kansas. always nice to see these heritage units, especially this one, since I ironically saw it up in Virginia 2 weeks before this day.
Nice.
Anyways, with 153 gone, there was still a Norfolk Southern activity for us to keep note of. 45R was beginning to exit the cargo plant as it was pulling its first cut of empties out of the storage track. And while they were doing this, we would once again quickly turn our attention back to the main line, because waiting a few miles down for 153 to pass was Norfolk Southern 242, which shortly appeared off in the horizon as it continues northward towards Charleston, South Carolina. With 242 gone and 45R stopped, we decided to return to the CSX tracks to now catch G908, reversing the second of its 2 big cuts that it had left in the yard. With the power out of sight here, we would move just down the street back to the Pilgrim's Pride feed mill to get a better view of the switching action and to now see 45R pulling further out of the cargo plant as it gets ready to switch tracks and couple up to its next cut of empties. Returning back to the CSX tracks, we can see G904 stopped here, and looking at the actual facility, we can see the trackmobile that will be used to switch some of the cars that have been left here, and we can actually see the conductor off in the facility down on the ground as he prepares to cut off some of the cars that will be left directly in the feed mill to be processed. G908 was pushing again here because they would need to clear one of the switches in order to be able to switch the rest of their cars into the storage tracks here. So with the crossing clear, I took the advantage to move up the hill to get a better view of 45R and to be surprised to hear yet another Norfolk Southern train. Norfolk Southern P64, the local Gainesville switcher, happened to spawn in out of nowhere as it returns from U-Hauling Yard after doing some work, giving us even more activity in the Gainesville area as 45R and G908 both continue doing their work. And shortly after the power pass, we would get to see both of these grain trades simultaneously doing their work on different tracks and giving a cool perspective of the different railroads serving different industries. 45R continues off in the distance building their train, the cut of cars behind the CSX power was very short because G908 here was at last concluding the storage of all their loaded cars. And moving down the street and into the midst of the facility, we can see the power on the grade that leads into the storage tracks, as the conductor on the ground finalizes the cut of these cars before the power shortly departs and concludes today's work. This would be the end of G908's storage of all its loaded cuts, and would also mark the end of the duties for today's crew. So this would be the last sighting of the CSX power for today, as G908 begins to take its power back to the yard right outside Gainesville, to store the power before G909, the southbound empty counterpart, would return back to this mill to collect all the empties and bring them back to Indiana. As for now, the CSX units would begin to rest, and in its wake, we get this little munchkin of a unit.
What is that?
This is a trackmobile. I already made a whole video on what this thing is and why it's used around here, but to keep it simple, this is a high railer-esque vehicle that can go on both the roads and the rails, and that offers the affordance of being able to pull all the cars that get dropped off here without the need of having a big locomotive that will use a lot more fuel and take up a lot more space. And fortunately for us, we get to see exactly what I mean by both the road and the rails.
Incredible.
Right now we're seeing the trackmobile stand up from its prior use of being on the rails, and now that it's moving by the road, it's beginning to reverse towards one of the cuts that have been left here by G908, getting ready to service the loads that the CSX train had brought in. Though this would mark the beginning of the Pilgrim Pride's work, this was the end of my day. I'd already been out here for a few hours, the CSX train was gone, 45R didn't have anything special on it, and there was nothing else running in the area that would make me want to stay out further. And besides, I had a very full day out here. We didn't see a crazy amount of trains today, but the action that we did see and the road activity that we did capture was pretty nice. Once again, shout out to my boy Silver Common Media for all the footage that you gave me and just being out here with me on this chase, in addition to the other bros with us today. And as for the rest of y'all, God bless. I will see you soon out on the high iron.